The SEAL instructor laughed in her face and asked if she'd wandered in from the typing pool by mistake. Lieutenant Bryn Cadelis had spent 6 years inside DVGRU, where operators moved through locked black sites and spoken code words that could end careers with a single syllable. And now she stood in a Norfolk briefing room surrounded by conventional officers who thought combat meant PowerPoint slides. In 30 seconds, she would authenticate her clearance with a phrase that would stop every heart in the room and force them to realize they'd just disrespected one of the deadliest intelligence operatives in naval special warfare. Bryn Cadelis was 29 years old and looked like she belonged anywhere except a room full of Navy SEALs. She stood 5 feet 6 inches with a runner's build, dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and the kind of calm presence that most people mistook the softness. She'd grown up in rural Montana outside Missoula, where her father, a retired Marine Scout sniper, had taught her to read wind speed by watching grass bend and to estimate range by counting heartbeats. By 16, she could put 5 rounds through a 2-inch circle at 400 m with iron sights. At 23, after enlisting and completing the intelligence specialist pipeline, she completed a commissioning program and earned her lieutenant's bars. She was recruited into DIVA's mission planning cell after finishing top of her class at the Navy's Advanced Technical Surveillance course. Now 6 years later, she carried a TSSCI clearance with special access programs so restricted that only a handful of people outside JOC even knew the unit existed. She was standing in a briefing room at Joint Expeditionary Base Little Creek in Virginia Beach, surrounded by a dozen officers from SEAL Team 4 who are preparing for a counter-terrorism rotation in East Africa. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world right now, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. And if stories like this one hit you the way they should, go ahead and subscribe, because there are more coming that you won't want to miss. The air smelled like stale coffee and the kind of overconfidence that comes from men who've never had to prove themselves to anyone outside their own tribe. Bryn's father had been a Marine Corps scout sniper with Force Recon, and he'd raised her the way he trained young Marines, with patience, precision, and zero tolerance for excuses. He taught her that accuracy wasn't about pulling a trigger. It was about controlling breath, reading mirage, calculating density, altitude, and making the rifle an extension of the nervous system. She'd grown up hunting moose deer in the bitter range, learning to move through terrain without sound, to glass ridge lines for hours without losing focus, and to wait in freezing cold until the shot presented itself cleanly. Her mother had been a research chemist, methodical and exact, and she'd passed down a different kind of discipline, the ability to absorb complex systems, see patterns in chaos, and stay 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Bryn had enlisted in the Navy at 21 with a degree in linguistics and a security clearance application already in progress. She'd been selected for the intelligence specialist rating and sent to advanced surveillance training at Damneck, where she learned to operate multispectral imaging systems, interpret signals intelligence, and build targeting packages for direct action missions. After 2 years, she completed officer candidate school and was commissioned as an intelligence officer. Shortly after, she was tapped for assignment to DIVGRU's mission planning cell, working alongside operators who carried out missions that never appeared in any official record. She spent the next 6 years in that world, learning how raids were planned, how targets were developed, how operational security was maintained at levels most people couldn't imagine, and she became fluent in the language of violence without ever firing a shot in anger. She'd learned early that her skills would always be questioned first and respected second. The briefing had started 20 minutes ago, with a confident lieutenant commander laying out an operation to capture a high-value target in Somalia. The plan was standard helicopter insertion, compound raid, X-file before dawn, and Bryn had sat quietly in the back of the room listening as the officer described entry points, clearance procedures, and enemy force estimates. Then he put up a satellite image of the target building and announced that the assault force would breach through the southern entrance because intelligence indicated it was the least defended approach. Bryn raised her hand. The lieutenant commander paused mid-sentence and looked at her like she'd just asked to use the restroom. He glanced at her Name tape, noted the lack of trident insignia on her uniform, and said her input wasn't required at this stage of planning. One of the senior enlisted SEALs in the front row turned around and grinned, muttering something to the man beside him about support staff who thought they understood tactical operations. The room filled with quiet laughter. Bryn kept her voice level and said the southern entrance was a kill zone. The most recent overhead imagery, pulled from an electro-optical satellite, past 16 hours earlier, showed 2 crews served weapons positioned in Defel with interlocking fields of fire that would shred the first 4 men through the door. She said the original intel package was 72 hours old and no longer reflected reality on the ground. The lieutenant commander's face flushed. He said his planning team had reviewed all available intelligence and didn't need a junior officer with no combat experience second-guessing their work. Another SEAL, this one, a senior chief with 20 years in, asked Bryn if she'd ever been outside the wire or if her idea of mission planning involved sitting in an air-conditioned TOC drinking lattes. The room went cold with the kind of contempt that doesn't need to be shouted. Bryn felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she'd felt a dozen times before in rooms where her presence was tolerated but never welcomed. She thought about the first time she'd walked into a DEV briefing and heard an operator ask if she was someone's girlfriend who'd gotten lost. She thought about the hundreds of hours she'd spent building target folders, cross-referencing signals, intelligence, with human reports, identifying vulnerabilities that turn missions from coin flips into surgical strikes. She thought about the operators who'd come back afterward and thanked her quietly, away from everyone else because they understood what she'd done, even if they couldn't say it out loud. Her father had told her once that respect was never given. It was taken by proving you could do the job better than the person doubting you. He'd said the world would always underestimate her because they couldn't see past the surface. And that meant she'd have to be twice as sharp, twice as precise, and twice as calm. Under pressure, she could feel the eyes on her, some amused, some annoyed, or dismissive. She knew what they saw. A woman in utilities without a trident, without deployment patches, without the tribal markers that signaled legitimacy in their world. They didn't know about the mission she'd supported, the target she'd identified, the intelligence gap she'd filled when operations hung in the balance. She took a slow breath and made a decision. Bryn stood and walked to the front of the room. The lieutenant commander looked at her like she'd violated some unspoken protocol, but he didn't stop her. She asked if the briefing space was a cleared SCIF, and after a long pause, he confirmed it was an accredited temporary SCIF with all personnel holding at least secret clearances for the operation. She asked for access to the JYCS terminal at the front of the briefing space. The senior chief exchanged a glance with the lieutenant commander, then nodded. Bryn inserted her CAC into the reader, entered her PIN, and the screen flashed a compartmentalized access banner that made 2 people in the front row lean forward. She navigated to a national imagery database that required RO-based authentication and pulled up a satellite feed time stamp 6 hours earlier. The image showed the target compound in near real-time resolution. She zoomed in on the southern entrance and highlighted the 2 machine gun positions she'd mentioned, then traced the probable line of fire across the approach corridor. She pulled up a second image from a different angle that showed additional fighters staged in a tree in 200 m to the east, an ambush element that hadn't been in the original brief. The room went silent. The senior chief leaned forward and asked where she'd gotten that imagery. Bryn said it came from a national asset tasked specifically to support JSOC operations, and access required special compartmented programs that most people in conventional units didn't carry. The lieutenant commander asked what unit she was actually assigned to, and his voice had changed. No more condescension, just the flat tone of someone realizing they'd made a serious miscalculation. Bin pulled up a third image showing a northern entrance partially obscured by vegetation with a clear approach route that avoided both the machine guns and the ambush element. She said the entry plan needed to be redesigned around this access point, and the timeline needed to shift by 2 hours to account for patrol patterns she'd identified in pattern of Life analysis conducted over the last 96 hours. One of the younger SEALs asked if she was just an analyst. Bryn said she'd been a mission planner and targeting officer assigned to Devolu's mission planning cell for the last 6 years, and that she'd worked more direct action raids than most of the people in the room had deployed on. The senior chief's expression shifted from skepticism to something closer to weariness. The lieutenant commander asked Bryn to properly identify her tasking authority. She pulled a message traffic printout from her pocket, a JSOC operational tasking order that assigned her as an embedded mission planner for this unit's rotation with authority to provide targeting guidance and assess operational planning procedures. The senior chief read the header and went pale. Then Bryn leaned closer to the senior chief and spoke a mission validation phrase used exclusively within JSOC special mission units to confirm compartmented access. It wasn't something you could fake, and it wasn't something anyone outside that world would ever hear. The phrase authenticated her role and confirmed she had operational standing to direct planning inputs for sensitive targeting data. The lieutenant commander stared at the tasking order, then asked why she hadn't identified herself at the beginning of the brief. Bryn said she'd been sent to observe the planning process and assess whether the unit was prepared to handle sensitive intelligence during their rotation. She said she hadn't intended to intervene, but when she saw them about to walk into an ambush based on outdated intelligence, she couldn't stay silent. She walked them through the revised entry plan step-by-step approach, vectors, breach points, timing windows, contingency routes, and explained how the new satellite imagery changed every assumption they built into the original mission. She referenced communications intercepts that indicated the target had been tipped off about potential American activity in the region, though she kept those details at a summary level given the mixed clearance levels in the room. She explained that the northern entrance wasn't just safer, it was the only viable option that didn't end with casualties before the assault force even entered the building. When she finished, the room was completely silent. The senior chief looked at the revised imagery, then looked at Bryn and said they'd scrub the original plan and rebuild around her recommendations. The lieutenant commander nodded and said he'd coordinate with higher command and the SJA to adjust the mission timeline and formalize the plan changes. One of the junior officers in the back asked how long she'd been doing this kind of work. Bryn said long enough to know when operators were about to make a mistake that would cost lives. The operation went forward 3 days later using Bryn's revised plan. The assault force breached through the northern entrance, captured the target without firing a shot, and exfiltrated cleanly before enemy reinforcements could respond. The after-action report noted that intelligence provided by an attached JSOC planner had been critical to mission success, and the team leader submitted a formal commendation citing her work as directly responsible for preventing friendly casualties. Back at Little Creek, the senior chief found Bryn in the intelligence shop and told her he owed her an apology. He said he'd been wrong. The lieutenant commander sent her a message through official channels, thanking her for the intervention and requesting her assistance on future operations. Other members of the team started asking her questions about targeting methodology and imagery interpretation. Bryn didn't gloat. She'd done what she'd been trained to do: see the problem, provide the solution, and move on. Her father had taught her that competence spoke louder than any argument. She stayed at Little Creek for another 2 weeks working with the team. When she left, the senior chief shook her hand and said she'd changed the way they thought about intelligence support. Bryn smiled and said she wasn't supported. She was an operator who just happened to work without a gun.